I spent 42 years on the bench as a district court judge in Queensland, presiding over thousands of cases involving fraud, property disputes, and contractual obligations, and the supreme irony of my situation is that I failed to apply even the most basic legal scrutiny to my own life when it mattered most. I am 70 years old. I lost 318,000 Australian dollars to a woman who told me she was divorced when she was, in fact, still legally married to a Thai man who was her business partner in a scheme that targeted foreign men exactly like me. The marriage certificate I signed in Pattaya in October of 2023 was legally void because she already had a husband, which meant that every property transfer, every business investment, every legal document I signed based on the premise that we were married was built on a foundation that didn't exist. My lawyer, when he finally explained this to me in his office in March of this year, used the phrase constructive fraud, which is a legal term meaning I'd been deceived into giving up my money based on false representations. I told him I didn't need the legal definition. I knew exactly what had happened. I'd been a judge for 4 decades, and I'd been conned like a first-year law student who'd never read a contract. The grief hit first. My wife Helen died in June of 2021 after a 14-month fight with pancreatic cancer that started with back pain she thought was from gardening and ended with her in a hospice bed weighing 43 kilograms and unable to recognize my face. We'd been married for 47 years. We'd raised 3 children who were now scattered across Australia and New Zealand with families of their own. Helen and I had planned to travel after I retired, to take the cruise through the Mediterranean we'd always talked about, to spend winters somewhere warm where her arthritis wouldn't hurt so much. We'd saved for it. We'd budgeted for it. And then she got sick, and we spent the money on private oncologists and experimental treatments that didn't work, and 18 months of watching her disappear in increments until there was nothing left but pain and morphine and me, sitting beside her bed holding a hand that didn't squeeze back. When she died, I felt relief first, which made me hate myself, and then I felt a grief so complete that for 6 months afterwards I genuinely didn't care whether I woke up the next morning or not. Retirement had happened automatically when I turned 68, which was the mandatory retirement age for district court judges in Queensland, and I'd fought it because work was the only thing keeping me functional after Helen died. Once I stopped working, I had nothing to organize my days around. I would wake up at 6 in the morning out of habit, make coffee for 1 instead of 2, and then sit in the kitchen of our house in Brisbane watching the clock and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with the next 14 hours before I could reasonably go to bed. My children called regularly and visited when they could, but they had their own lives, and I could hear the worry in their voices when they talked to me, the fear that I was sliding into a depression I wouldn't climb out of. They suggested therapy. They suggested support groups for widowers. They suggested I get a dog. I did none of these things because I didn't want to feel better. Feeling better would have meant moving past Helen, and I wasn't ready to do that. Thailand came into my life through a golf trip in January of 2023. A former colleague, another retired judge I'll call Bill, had organized it. 10 days in Pattaya playing golf at courses along the eastern seaboard, staying at a resort that catered to Australian tourists, drinking at bars where the staff spoke English and the beer was cold and cheap. I went because Bill insisted and because I had nothing else to do and because some part of me recognized that if I didn't leave Brisbane, I would spend the rest of my life sitting in that kitchen waiting to die. The golf was fine. The resort was fine. The weather was warm and the ocean was visible from my balcony, and none of it made me feel anything except a dull acknowledgement that I was still technically alive. On the 4th evening, Bill dragged me to a bar called something like Sunset Lounge or Ocean View, or one of those generic names that every tourist bar in Pattaya seems to have, and I sat at a table drinking Chang beer and watching Bill flirt with women who were young enough to be his granddaughters, and I felt a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who are having fun when you're incapable of having fun yourself. Rungtiwa was working behind the bar that night. I noticed her because she wasn't participating in the aggressive friendliness that the other staff were deploying on the customers. She served drinks efficiently and politely, but without the manufactured enthusiasm that I'd started to find exhausting after 4 days of being told that everything was amazing and I was handsome and did I want another beer. When I went to the bar to order, she made eye contact and asked what I wanted in English that was clear and unaccented. And when I ordered, she poured the beer and took my money, and didn't try to start a conversation about where I was from, or how long I was staying, or any of the other opening gambits I'd heard 100 times already. I appreciated the lack of performance. The next night, I went back to the same bar specifically to sit at her section of the bar. And this time when she served me, I asked her name. She said Rungtiwa, but that customers usually called her Tui, because it was easier. I said I could manage Rungtiwa. She smiled slightly and said most Farron couldn't. I asked if she'd lived in Pattaya long. She said 10 years, since she was 18. I asked if she liked it. She said it was work, the same as anywhere. Over the remaining 6 nights of the trip, I became a regular at that bar. I would play golf with Bill during the day, and then in the evening, I would go to the bar and sit in Rungtiwa's section and order beers I didn't really want just to have an excuse to talk to her. We had conversations that were brief and transactional on the surface, but that I came to look forward to with an intensity that surprised me. She told me she'd grown up in Buriram, a province in the northeast, and had come to Pattaya to work in hotels and bars because there were no jobs in her village. She said she'd been married once but was divorced now, that her ex-husband had been Thai and the marriage had lasted 3 years before it fell apart. She said she lived in a small apartment in Naklua with a friend who also worked in bars. She asked me what I did and I said I was retired, that I'd been a judge in Australia. She asked what kind of judge. I said mostly civil cases, property disputes, contract law, things like that. She said that sounded interesting. I said it had been interesting until it became routine. She said most things were like that. On the last night before I flew back to Brisbane, I asked her if she would stay in touch, if I could have her line contact so we could message. She said yes and gave me her number, and I felt a small spark of something that might have been hope or might have been just the relief of making a human connection that felt reciprocal rather than commercial. I flew home. I messaged her. She messaged back. The messages were mundane at first. Updates about our days, questions about the weather and food and what we were doing. Gradually, they became more personal. She told me about the difficulties of working in Pattaya's bar industry, the expectations from customers, the pressure to be constantly smiling and available. I told her about Helen, about the grief, about the house that felt too large and too empty. She said she understood loneliness. I said I thought she probably did. By March, we were messaging every day, sometimes for hours. By April, she told me she was thinking about me more than she should. By May, I told her I was thinking about visiting Thailand again just to see her. I flew back to Pattaya in late June. This time, I didn't stay at the resort with the golf courses. I rented an apartment near Naklua for a month to see if I could tolerate extended time in Thailand or whether it would drive me insane the way Brisbane was driving me insane. Rungtiwa came to visit on her days off. We went to restaurants and beaches and temples, and she would explain Thai customs and language in a way that felt educational rather than performative. And I felt myself warming to the idea that maybe, possibly, I could build some kind of life here that would be different enough from my life in Brisbane that I wouldn't spend every day thinking about Helen. The physical relationship started in the second week. I'd been celibate for 2 years since Helen got too sick for intimacy, and I'd assumed that part of my life was over. But Rungtiwa was patient and gentle, and made me feel like I was still capable of being desired rather than just pitied. It felt significant. It felt like a door opening. She told me in July that she wanted to leave bar work, that she was tired of the industry and wanted to start a small business but didn't have the capital. I asked what kind of business. She said a laundry service for tourists and expats, something steady and respectable that didn't require her to smile at drunk men or pretend to be interested in conversations she'd had 1,000 times before. I asked how much capital she needed. She said maybe 200,000 baht to start, about 7,000 Australian dollars, for equipment and a lease on a small shop front. I gave her the money. I didn't think of it as an investment or even as a loan. I thought of it as a gift to someone who'd made me feel like life might be bearable again. She cried when I transferred the money. She said no one had ever believed in her like this. I said I was happy to help. She said she would pay me back once the business was profitable. I said there was no need, that I had more than enough and she should use any profit to grow the business. The laundry service opened in August in a small shop front in Naklua. It was real. I visited it. There were washing machines and dryers, and a counter where customers could drop off clothes. Rangtiwa hired 2 staff, women from her province who needed work. The business seemed legitimate and modestly successful, and I felt proud of having helped make it happen. She told me in September that she wanted to expand, that there was demand for pickup and delivery services, but she'd need a vehicle and another staff member. She said she'd been saving, but it would take 2 years to accumulate enough from the business profits. I offered to invest another 100,000 baht. She said she couldn't accept more money from me without giving me something in return. I said her company was enough. She said no. She wanted me to be a formal partner in the business, that we should register it properly with me as a 50% shareholder. I said I didn't need to be a shareholder, that I trusted her to run it. She said trust wasn't the point, that in Thai culture, business partnerships needed to be formalized, and that if I didn't become a proper partner, it would look like she was taking advantage of me. I agreed to become a partner. She arranged for the registration through a business attorney she knew. I signed documents that were in Thai with English translations attached. I became a 50% owner of a laundry business in Naklua. We were married on October 14, 2023. It wasn't a large ceremony, just a registration at the district office in Pattaya with 2 witnesses who were friends of Rangtiwa's from her village. She wore white. I wore a suit I'd brought from Brisbane. We took photographs on the steps of the office and had dinner afterwards at a restaurant on the beach. She cried during the ceremony, and I cried too. Not because I'd moved on from Helen, but because I was grateful to have found someone who made me feel like I wasn't just waiting to die. She moved into the apartment I'd been renting, and we started talking about buying something more permanent. A condo or maybe a house with a small garden where she could grow vegetables. I felt like I was building a second life, different from my first life with Helen but valuable in its own right. And for the first time since Helen died, I felt like the future contained something other than emptiness. The business expanded in November. Rangtiwa said a hotel group had approached her about providing laundry services for 3 properties in Jomtien, which would triple the current revenue but would require more equipment and staff. She said the contract would make the business genuinely profitable, that we'd start seeing returns that would justify the investment. She showed me the contract. It looked legitimate, printed on letterhead from a hotel management company I'd heard of, with terms and payment schedules that seemed reasonable. I asked how much the expansion would cost. She said approximately 400,000 baht, about 14,000 Australian dollars. I said I could cover it. She said we should do it as a business loan rather than a direct investment, that it would be better for tax purposes to show it as debt rather than equity contribution. I agreed. I transferred 400,000 baht to the business account. She signed a promissory note, agreeing to repay it with 5% interest over 3 years. Everything felt professional and above board, and I was pleased with how seriously she was taking the business. The promissory note should have been my first clue that something was wrong, but I was thinking like a lawyer rather than thinking like someone who might be getting defrauded. The note was professionally drafted with clear terms and repayment schedules, and that professionalism made it feel legitimate rather than making me question why she needed such formal documentation for a loan between spouses. Looking back, I think the formality was designed specifically to make me comfortable, to make me feel like everything was being handled properly, when in fact the very existence of the note suggested she was treating me as an outside creditor rather than a partner. A husband lending money to his wife's business wouldn't typically need a promissory note. The fact that she insisted on one should have told me something about how she viewed our relationship, but at the time I interpreted it as her being responsible and wanting to keep business matters separate from personal matters. I started asking more questions in late November about the financial performance of the business. We'd invested approximately 700,000 baht total at that point, roughly 25,000 Australian dollars, and I wanted to see revenue figures and profit margins and some indication that the money was generating returns. Rangtiwa would show me spreadsheets that listed income and expenses, and the numbers looked plausible, but when I asked for bank statements or receipts to verify the figures, she would say that Thai businesses didn't keep records the same way Australian businesses did, that everything was more informal, that I needed to trust the numbers she was giving me. I said I did trust her, but that as a business partner I had a right to see documentation. She said I was treating her like an employee rather than an equal partner, that I was micromanaging because I couldn't accept that a Thai woman might understand business better than I did. The accusation stung enough that I backed off. I didn't want to be the colonial foreigner who assumed he knew better than the locals. I didn't want to be that person. So I accepted the spreadsheets and stopped asking for backup documentation. December was when I started noticing things I couldn't quite explain. Rungtiwa was busier than usual, which made sense given the hotel contract, but she was also more evasive about her schedule. She would leave early in the morning and come back late at night, and when I asked about her day, she would give me general answers about customer meetings and staff problems without providing specific details. I noticed she had a new phone, an expensive iPhone that cost probably 30,000 baht, which she said a friend had sold her at a discount. I noticed she'd bought new jewelry, gold pieces that weren't extravagant, but that didn't match her usual style of minimal accessories. When I asked about these purchases, she said they'd been gifts from a satisfied customer or that she'd found them on sale or that she'd been saving for them for months. The explanations were plausible, but they accumulated in a way that made me uneasy without giving me specific reasons to be suspicious. There was a particular incident in mid-December that I keep returning to in memory. Rungtiwa's phone rang while we were having dinner at home, and she glanced at the screen and then told me she needed to take the call outside. She stepped onto the balcony and closed the sliding door behind her. I could see her through the glass, but I couldn't hear what she was saying, and the conversation lasted probably 15 minutes. When she came back, I asked who'd called. She said it was a supplier who had questions about an order. I asked why she needed to take that call outside. She said the supplier was yelling about a delivery problem, and she didn't want me to hear the arguing because it would stress me out. I accepted this explanation, but some part of me registered that her body language during the call hadn't looked like someone dealing with an angry supplier. She'd been smiling. She'd been relaxed. Whatever conversation she was having, it hadn't been stressful. I asked to visit the laundry operation in early January to see how the hotel contract was progressing. Rungtiwa said the timing wasn't good, that they were installing new equipment and the site was chaotic, and it would be better to wait until everything was operational. I said I didn't mind chaos, that I just wanted to see what we'd built. She said I didn't trust her, that I was treating her like an employee rather than a wife and business partner. I said that wasn't what I meant, that I was proud of the business and wanted to be involved. She said the problem was that I wanted to control everything, that I couldn't let her run the business without constantly checking on her. I apologized. I said she was right, that I was being overbearing, that she should handle the business however she thought best. She said she appreciated my understanding. I didn't visit the laundry. What I should have done, what any rational person would have done, was insist on visiting despite her objections. The fact that she was so adamant about keeping me away should have been the clearest possible signal that something was wrong. But I'd spent 9 months building a relationship where questioning her judgment meant being accused of not trusting her or not respecting Thai culture, and I'd been trained by those 9 months to back down whenever she pushed back. That training served her purposes perfectly. The first serious warning came in February from an Australian expat I knew casually through Bill, a man who'd retired to Pattaya 5 years earlier and who knew the local business community better than I did. He pulled me aside one evening at a bar and asked whether I knew that Rungtiwa had a business partner who wasn't me. I said no. I was the only partner. We'd registered the business together. He said he'd heard otherwise, that there was a Thai man involved who handled vendor relationships and who'd been working with Rungtiwa since before I'd met her. I asked where he'd heard this. He said, from multiple people in the laundry industry who knew both Rungtiwa and this man. I asked who the man was. He said he didn't have a name but that people referred to him as her husband, which he'd assumed was a mistranslation or a cultural confusion but which I might want to investigate. I said Rungtiwa had been married before but was divorced. He said maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, but I should verify it, because Pattaya was full of stories about foreign men who'd invested in businesses with Thai partners who turned out to have complications the foreigners didn't know about. I confronted Rungtiwa that night. I asked her directly if there was another man involved in the business. She said no, absolutely not, that she worked with male vendors and suppliers but there was no partnership beyond what we had. I asked if her ex-husband was involved in any way. She said she hadn't spoken to her ex-husband in years, that he lived in Bangkok and they had no contact. I asked about the rumor that people referred to a man as her husband. She said this was typical expat gossip, that faring men in Pattaya loved to create drama and spread rumors about Thai women they didn't even know. She said if I believed gossip over her, then maybe I didn't know her at all. I said I believed her. She said she hoped so because if I didn't trust her, then we had nothing. I apologized for bringing it up. She accepted the apology, but she was distant for the next week, punishing me subtly for having doubted her. I should have investigated. I should have done what I'd spent 42 years teaching myself to do as a judge, which was to verify claims independently rather than accepting representations at face value. But I didn't because investigating would have meant admitting that I didn't trust my wife, and not trusting my wife would have meant admitting that the second life I'd built in Thailand was potentially as much of a delusion as I feared it was. I chose to believe her because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. This is how otherwise intelligent people make catastrophic decisions. This is how I made mine. The discovery happened on March 8th through a lawyer I hadn't hired and didn't want. I received a phone call from an attorney named Somchai, who introduced himself as representing a property management company in Jomtien. He said he needed to speak with me about a contract dispute involving a business registered to me and a woman named Rungtiwa. I said I wasn't aware of any contract dispute. He said there was an unpaid invoice for laundry services totaling 87,000 baht, and that his client was preparing to file a claim in civil court unless payment was made within 7 days. I said I would speak to my wife about it. He said he needed to meet with me in person because there were issues with the business registration that I should be aware of before any court proceedings began. I agreed to meet him the next day at his office in Pattaya. The office was small and cluttered, stacks of folders on every surface and a window air conditioning unit that barely worked. Somchai was in his 50s, thin and precise in his manner, and he spoke English well enough that we didn't need a translator. He asked me to confirm that I was listed as a 50% owner of the laundry business. I said yes. He asked when the business had been registered. I said October of last year. He pulled out a folder and handed me a document. It was a business registration certificate dated March of 2022, 18 months before I'd met Rungtiwa. The business was registered to 2 owners. One was Rungtiwa. The other was a man named Prazert, whose surname I didn't recognize. I looked at Somchai and said this couldn't be right, that I'd registered the business with Rungtiwa in October of 2023. He said no. According to government records, the business had been registered in 2022 and hadn't been amended since. I said I'd signed documents. He said I might have signed documents, but they hadn't been properly filed, or they'd been filed incorrectly, or they were forged. He said this happened frequently with foreign investors in Thailand who trusted their partners to handle registration without verifying the paperwork independently. I felt the room tilt. I asked who Prazert was. Somchai said he didn't know personally, but that according to his research, Prazert was listed on multiple business registrations with Rungtiwa, suggesting an ongoing partnership. I asked if they were married. Somchai said he couldn't answer that without accessing marriage records, but that if I wanted him to check, he could file a request with the district office. I said yes, check. He made a note. He said the larger issue was that if I wasn't actually a registered owner of the business, then I had no legal standing to resolve the contract dispute and no claim to any assets the business held. He said if I'd transferred money to the business believing I was a partner, then I'd need to pursue recovery through a civil claim against Rungtiwa and potentially Prazert. He said this would be expensive and time-consuming and would require proving that I'd been fraudulently misled, which was difficult in Thai courts, particularly when the defendant was Thai and the plaintiff was foreign. I left his office, and I drove back to the apartment in a state I can only describe as shock. I had prosecuted fraud cases. I had presided over civil disputes where one party had misrepresented material facts to induce another party to act to their detriment. I knew exactly what had happened to me in legal terms. What I couldn't process was how I'd failed to see it happening, how I'd allowed myself to be placed in the position of the defrauded party when I'd spent my entire career on the other side of that equation. I sat in the apartment for 3 hours waiting for Rungtiwa to come home. She arrived at 7. I showed her the business registration document that Somchai had given me. I asked her to explain it. She looked at it for perhaps 5 seconds and then she said it was a mistake, that this was an old registration from a failed business she'd tried to start with a friend and that our business was separate. I said the business name on this document was identical to the name on the business we'd supposedly registered together. She said that was a coincidence, that laundry businesses often had similar names. I said I wanted to see our registration documents, the ones I'd signed in October. She said they were in a safe deposit box at a bank. I said I wanted to see them tomorrow. She said the bank was closed on weekends and we'd have to wait until Monday. I said, fine, Monday then. Monday came. Rungtiwa said she couldn't access the safe deposit box because she'd forgotten which bank it was in. Tuesday, she said she'd checked 3 banks and couldn't find the box. Wednesday, she stopped answering when I asked about it. Thursday, I went back to Somchai's office and asked him to check the marriage records. He called me Friday afternoon. He said Rungtiwa was currently married to Prasert. The marriage had been registered in January of 2021. There was no record of a divorce. The marriage certificate I'd signed with Rungtiwa in October of 2023 was legally invalid because she'd already been married at the time. Under Thai law, you couldn't be married to 2 people simultaneously, which meant our marriage didn't exist in any legal sense. I need to pause here because this is the point where the story stops being about financial loss and becomes about something harder to quantify. The money I'd given her totaled approximately 318,000 Australian dollars across the initial gift for starting the business, the expansion investment, and the loan for the hotel contract. That was real money and losing it hurt. But I'm 70 years old, and I still have other savings and a pension that will sustain me for the rest of my life. What I lost that was irreplaceable was the belief that I'd found something genuine after Helen died, that the affection Rungtiwa had shown me was real rather than performed, that the life we'd been building together had meant something beyond the transfer of my money into accounts she and Prasert controlled. I'd spent 42 years learning to read people, to detect deception, to identify when someone was misrepresenting facts for personal gain, and I'd failed completely when it mattered to me personally. That failure is what I can't reconcile. I confronted Rungtiwa on Saturday evening with the marriage certificate showing her marriage to Prasert. She didn't deny it. She said yes, she was still married, but it was complicated, that Prasert was her business partner, and the marriage was on paper only for visa purposes, and that she and I had a real relationship even if it wasn't legally formalized. I asked her why she'd gone through the ceremony with me if she knew it was invalid. She said, because I'd wanted to get married and she'd wanted to make me happy and she hadn't thought it mattered because love didn't require paperwork. I asked her about the money, about the $318,000 I'd given her for a business I didn't actually own. She said, I did own it, that the paperwork was just slow to process, that Thai bureaucracy took time. I said Somchai had shown me that the business had been registered 2 years ago with her and Prasert as the only owners. She said Somchai was lying, that he was working for people who wanted to damage her business. I asked who those people were. She couldn't answer. I asked her to show me any proof that I owned any portion of the business. She said the proof was in the safe deposit box. I said the safe deposit box didn't exist. She started crying. The crying lasted for approximately 20 minutes. When it stopped, she said, I was being cruel, that I was treating her like a criminal when all she'd done was try to build a business and a life with me. She said Thai partnerships were complicated and that I'd never understood Thai culture, and I'd always looked down on her for being Thai. I said this wasn't about culture. This was about fraud and about lying to me repeatedly over a period of 9 months. She said if I thought she'd defrauded me, I should take her to court. I said I would. She said good luck getting justice in a Thai court as a foreigner accusing a Thai woman. She said courts in Thailand understood that foreign men came here to take advantage of poor women and that judges wouldn't believe I was the victim. I said I'd been a judge for 42 years, and I knew how courts worked, and she should stop pretending I was the oppressor in this situation. She said I didn't understand anything. She left. I haven't seen her since. What I learned from Somchai over the following weeks was that Rungtiwa and Prasert had been running variations of this scheme for at least 5 years. They would target older foreign men, usually widowers or divorcees, usually men with savings but without family nearby, usually men who were lonely enough to be grateful for attention from a younger woman. Rungtiwa would develop a relationship, usually starting in a bar or restaurant where she worked, and then after a few months, she would introduce the business opportunity. The business was always real enough to pass casual inspection, which made the fraud harder to detect and harder to prove in court. Foreign men would invest believing they were helping their girlfriend or wife build a legitimate enterprise. The investments would be absorbed into business operations that Rungtiwa and Prasert controlled through the original registration. When the foreign men eventually questioned what was happening, Rungtiwa would either disappear or would threaten to accuse them of being abusive or controlling, which was usually enough to make the men leave Thailand rather than fight. Somchai estimated that they'd extracted somewhere between 1 and 2 million Australian dollars from approximately 8 to 12 foreign men over 5 years. No one had successfully recovered money through the Thai courts because proving fraud required documentation that the victims didn't have. I hired a lawyer to pursue civil recovery anyway. I understood the odds were poor, but I needed to try because trying was the only alternative to accepting that I'd lost $318,000 and the belief that I'd built a meaningful relationship and that there was no recourse available. The lawyer filed a claim in March. Rungtiwa and Prasert responded in April through their own attorney, arguing that I'd made gifts rather than investments and that the burden of proving fraud was on me. The lawyer said we could subpoena bank records and business documents, but that even if we proved the business was registered to Rungtiwa and Prasert, that didn't prove fraud. It just proved I'd failed to verify ownership before transferring money. He said the case might take 2 to 3 years to resolve and might cost 40,000 Australian dollars in legal fees, and that at the end we might win a judgment we couldn't enforce because the assets would have been moved, hidden. I told him to continue anyway. I'm writing this in June from an apartment in Hua Hin where I moved because I couldn't stand to stay in Pattaya, where every street reminded me of something Rungtiwa had told me that turned out to be a lie. I haven't returned to Brisbane because returning would mean admitting to my children that their 70-year-old father had been scammed by a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, and I'm not ready for that conversation yet. I spend my days reviewing the legal documents from the case, looking for some detail I missed, some evidence that might shift the odds in my favor. I spend my evenings replaying the relationship in my head, trying to identify the exact moment when I should have known I was being deceived. Was it when she asked for the first investment? Was it when she avoided letting me visit the business? Was it when the expat warned me about her having another partner, and I chose to believe her denial? I can't locate the moment because the whole relationship was the moment. The deception was total and structural rather than a single lie I could have caught if I'd been paying attention. What this has taught me, if you can call it teaching when the tuition cost $318,000 and whatever remained of my professional pride, is that expertise in one domain provides no protection in another. I knew contract law. I knew how to evaluate evidence. I knew how to identify when someone was misrepresenting material facts. None of that knowledge translated into my personal life because I wanted to believe Rungtiwa more than I wanted to verify what she was telling me. The want was stronger than the knowledge. That's the lesson. That's what I'm left with. Wanting someone to be genuine doesn't make them genuine. Grief doesn't entitle you to a second chance at happiness. Loneliness doesn't mean the next person who shows you affection is trustworthy. These are obvious truths that I knew intellectually but couldn't apply emotionally when it mattered. If you're reading this because you're in a similar situation, because you've met someone in Thailand who seems too good to be true and you're thinking about investing money in a business or a property or a future together, I'm telling you to verify everything independently before you transfer a single dollar. Hire your own lawyer. Get documents translated by someone you pay directly rather than someone your partner recommends. Check business registrations with government offices rather than trusting papers your partner shows you. Verify that the person you're planning to marry is actually divorced if they claim to be divorced. These are simple steps that take minimal time and cost minimal money, and that would have saved me $318,000 and 2 years of my life. I didn't take these steps because I thought I was too smart to be scammed and because I wanted to believe I'd found something real. I was wrong on both counts. Don't make the same mistake I did. The cost is too high and the recovery too uncertain, and the regret too permanent. I don't know what happens next. The lawsuit will proceed and likely fail. Eventually, I'll return to Brisbane and face my children and admit what happened. Eventually, the savings will stabilize, and I'll settle into whatever life looks like for a 70-year-old retired judge living alone in a house that's too big. What I know is that I'll never trust my judgment about people again. that the 42 years I spent on the bench learning to evaluate credibility and detect deception were apparently worthless when applied to my own situation, and that grief makes you vulnerable in ways that intelligence can't protect against. That's what I learned. That's what it cost me to learn it. I'm giving you the lesson for free. Whether you listen is your choice. I hope you're smarter than I was.